This week, Statistics Canada released data that revealed the scale of a quiet revolution in North American relationships that has unfolded largely outside public attention. Between January and December 2025, 7.6 million fewer Canadian vehicles crossed into the United States compared to 2024, representing a 30.9% collapse in land-based cross-border travel. This was not a gradual decline or seasonal adjustment, but rather an unprecedented withdrawal from a relationship that had defined daily life for millions of people along the world, as longest undefended border for over a century. The magnitude of this withdrawal becomes clear when considered alongside the broader patterns of Canadian behavior toward the United States during 2025. The 7.6 million vehicle reduction was accompanied by parallel declines in air travel, with Canadian trips to American destinations falling by significant percentages across all major routes. Together, these changes represented the largest sustained reduction in Canada-US travel since the implementation of COVID-19 border restrictions. But unlike the pandemic closures, this reduction was entirely voluntary. British Columbia bore the brunt of this transformation, with southbound crossings into Washington state declining by 36% annually, representing nearly 1 million fewer individual border crossings. The consistency of this decline was remarkable. Every single month from February through December 2025 showed double-digit percentage decreases compared to the corresponding periods in 2024. By December, the gap had widened to 38%, with December traditionally being one of the busiest months for cross-border holiday shopping and vacation travel. The Whatcom Council of Governments, which tracks cross-border traffic at the Peace Arch, Pacific Highway, Linden, and Sumas border crossings, recorded 100,000 fewer personal vehicles in December alone compared to December 2024. This represented the 11th consecutive month of decline, suggesting that what initially appeared to be a temporary response to political tensions had crystallized into a fundamental shift in Canadian travel behavior. The timing of the collapse was particularly significant because it coincided with specific policy developments that revealed the underlying tensions driving the withdrawal. The decline began in February 2025, immediately following the implementation of Trump's initial tariff announcements and escalating rhetoric about Canadian sovereignty. However, the persistence and acceleration of the decline throughout the year suggested that Canadian behavior was responding to deeper concerns than immediate policy disputes. Quebec recorded the steepest declines in cross-border travel, with same-day trips to the United States falling by 52.5% in May 2025 compared to May 2024. British Columbia followed closely with a 52.3% decline in same-day travel, while Ontario, despite hosting some of Canada's busiest border crossings, still recorded a 33.7% reduction. These numbers were particularly striking because they represented the first time since the pandemic that all provinces bordering the United States simultaneously recorded significant declines in cross-border travel. The economic implications of this withdrawal were immediately visible in American border communities that had built their economic models around Canadian visitors. Blaine, Washington, a city of approximately 5,000 residents that had historically relied on Canadian shoppers for economic vitality, saw businesses closing and commercial districts emptying as the flow of northbound customers dried up. Gas stations that had operated on thin margins, sustained by high-volume Canadian traffic, found themselves unable to maintain profitability. Immigration lawyer Len Saunders, based in Blaine, characterized the situation as an absolute collapse of cross-border travel from Canada. His observations were particularly significant because Saunders had specialized in Canada-US immigration issues for decades and had witnessed previous fluctuations in cross-border relationships. His assessment that the 2025 decline represented unprecedented withdrawal suggested that the current crisis differed qualitatively from previous periods of tension. The Bellingham area, which had traditionally attracted Canadian visitors for shopping, dining, and recreational activities, experienced similar economic disruption. The mayor and city council wrote letters to British Columbia municipalities attempting to maintain relationships and encourage continued visits. But these outreach efforts appeared to have limited impact on Canadian travel decisions. The letters themselves were significant as they represented recognition by American border communities that the withdrawal was not simply economics, but had become political and psychological. The data revealed interesting variations in how different types of travel were affected by the broader withdrawal pattern. Same-day excursion trips, which had traditionally represented impulse shopping, and casual recreational visits showed the steepest declines, falling by 40.3% nationally in May 2025. Overnight travel also declined significantly by 34.3%, but the smaller percentage suggested that Canadians were more willing to maintain longer, planned visits while eliminating shorter routine crossings. Air travel between Canada and the United States showed different patterns, but confirmed the broader trend of Canadian withdrawal from American destinations. Canadian return trips from the United States by air had been declining since September 2023, predating the most intense period of political tension. By May 2025, air travel declines reached 24.2% year over year, suggesting that Canadian skepticism about American destinations had been building gradually before being accelerated by trade disputes. The Windsor-Detroit corridor, traditionally one of the busiest Canada-US border crossing areas, showed more resilience than other regions, but still recorded significant declines. Canadian vehicle crossings fell by approximately 11% annually, representing 400,000 fewer vehicles. The relative stability of Windsor-Detroit crossings reflected the area's unique characteristics, including substantial cross-border employment relationships and deeply integrated economic structures that made complete withdrawal more difficult. Tal Kshudner, CEO of the Windsor-Detroit Tunnel, noted that approximately 11,000 people living in Windsor, Essex, travel to Detroit daily for employment, particularly in healthcare, information technology, engineering, and automotive sectors. This employment-based travel created a baseline of crossing activity that was less sensitive to political tensions, helping to maintain higher crossing volumes despite broader Canadian withdrawal from American destinations. The new U.S. border regulations implemented in December 2025 provided additional acceleration to the withdrawal trend. The requirement that all non-U.S. travelers, including Canadians, be photographed at land border crossings eliminated previous exemptions and created additional processing time and psychological barriers for Canadian visitors. The regulation, combined with proposed requirements for social media history disclosure, reinforced Canadian perceptions that visits to the United States had become more complicated and potentially intrusive. The Canada Border Services Agency's decision to terminate the remote area border crossing program effective September 2026 represented the Canadian government as a response to changing cross-border relationships. The RABC program, which had allowed approximately 11,000 people annually to cross into Canada through specified remote areas with minimal processing, would be replaced by mandatory telephone reporting requirements. The policy change reflected recognition that traditional assumptions about border permeability were no longer politically sustainable. The psychological dimensions of the border withdrawal extended beyond immediate policy concerns to encompass broader questions about national identity and international relationships. For many Canadians, particularly those living in border communities, regular visits to the United States had been integral to their lifestyle and identity. The withdrawal represented a conscious decision to prioritize Canadian sovereignty and economic independence over convenience and cultural familiarity. The economic impact data revealed the scale of revenue lost by American businesses due to reduced Canadian visitation. Tourism economics projected that travel from Canada to the United States would decline by 20% annually, with the impact felt most severely in border states like New York, Michigan, Washington, and popular tourist destinations like California, Nevada, and Florida. The projected revenue losses ran into billions of dollars, affecting employment in tourism, retail, and hospitality sectors. Canadian airports reported adjustments to flight capacity as airlines responded to reduced demand for American destinations. Vancouver Airport Authority recorded 2.2% declines in passengers on U.S. routes in July 2025, while airlines like Flair suspended service to destinations like Palm Springs and Phoenix, while maintaining routes to cities with stronger demand patterns like Los Angeles and San Francisco. The broader international context revealed that Canada's withdrawal from American destinations was part of a global pattern of reduced travel to the United States. U.S. International Trade Administration data showed declining international arrivals from Europe, with Western European visitors to the United States falling by 17% year over year in March 2025. While European travel rebounded somewhat in subsequent months, the overall trend suggested that America's attractiveness as an international destination had declined globally, not just among Canadians. The comparison with historical precedents provided perspective on the scale of the current withdrawal. Statistics. Canada analysts noted that declines of the magnitude seen in 2025 had previously occurred only during major crisis events, such as the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks, which caused a 31.2% decline in same-day automobile travel, and the 2008 financial crisis, which resulted in a 22.8% reduction. The 2025 decline was notable, both for its magnitude and its duration, persisting throughout the entire year, rather than representing a short-term shock response. The technological tracking systems that documented the withdrawal provided unprecedented detail about the patterns and timing of Canadian behavioral changes. The Cascade Gateway Border Data Warehouse, which monitors southbound traffic by vehicles with British Columbia license plates, recorded monthly declines beginning in February 2025, with only January showing positive year-over-year growth at 10%. The consistency of subsequent monthly declines suggested that the withdrawal was sustained and systematic rather than episodic. eSIM card purchase data from companies like Airalo provided additional confirmation of reduced Canadian travel to American destinations. While the United States remained the most popular international destination for Canadian travelers, data showed increased Canadian interest in European and Asian destinations, suggesting that travel budgets were being redirected rather than simply reduced. The airline industry response revealed the commercial implications of sustained reductions in Canada-US travel demand. Carriers reported shifting capacity from American routes to domestic Canadian destinations or international routes to other countries, reflecting assessments that Canadian demand for American travel was unlikely to recover quickly. These capacity adjustments had long-term implications, because aviation capacity planning typically operates on multi-year cycles. The financial services industry data provided additional insight into the patterns of Canadian spending behavior regarding American destinations. Credit card transaction data, while not publicly available in detail, was reported by industry sources to show significant reductions in American retail purchases by Canadian cardholders, confirming that the border crossing data reflected genuine changes in economic activity rather than simply altered transportation patterns. The retail and hospitality sectors in American border communities developed various strategies to maintain revenue despite reduced Canadian visitation. Some businesses increased marketing efforts targeting American customers, while others adjusted their product offerings to focus on goods and services that were less dependent on cross-border traffic. However, the geographic location and specialized nature of many border businesses made adaptation difficult, leading to business closures and commercial district deterioration. The real estate implications of sustained border closure became apparent in both American border communities and Canadian border regions. American commercial properties that had depended on Canadian foot traffic experienced declining values, while some Canadian border communities saw reduced economic activity as cross-border shopping and employment relationships diminished. The real estate impacts reflected recognition by market participants that the border changes might be permanent rather than temporary. The infrastructure utilization implications were equally significant. Border crossing facilities that had been designed and staffed to handle much higher volumes of traffic found themselves operating below capacity, leading to questions about optimal resource allocation and future infrastructure planning. The underutilization of border infrastructure represented sunk costs that could not be easily recovered if traffic patterns did not return to previous levels. The cultural implications of reduced cross-border travel extended beyond immediate economic impacts to affect family relationships, cultural exchanges, and community connections that had developed over generations. Border communities on both sides of the international boundary had historically maintained close relationships that transcended political boundaries, but sustained reductions in cross-border travel threatened to weaken these connections. Educational exchange programs, cross-border sports leagues, cultural festivals, and other community activities that had relied on easy border crossing found themselves needing to adapt to new realities of reduced cross-border mobility. These adaptations represented long-term changes in the social fabric of border communities that might persist even if political tensions eventually resolved. The seasonal patterns of border crossing reductions provided additional insight into the nature of Canadian withdrawal from American destinations. Traditional peak travel periods, including spring break seasons and summer vacation months, showed consistent year-over-year declines, suggesting that Canadians were not simply deferring travel, but were actively choosing alternative destinations or activities. The holiday shopping season traditionally represented one of the busiest periods for Canadian cross-border travel, as favorable exchange rates and product availability had historically attracted Canadian shoppers to American retail destinations. The 38% decline in December 2025 border crossings suggested that even deeply established seasonal travel patterns were being disrupted by broader changes in Canadian attitudes toward American destinations. As 2026 began, the accumulated data from 2025 provided clear evidence that the Canada-US border had undergone a fundamental transformation. The 7.6 million vehicle reduction represented more than statistics. It documented the largest voluntary withdrawal from cross-border relationships in the modern history of Canada-US relations. The withdrawal was systematic, sustained, and appeared to reflect deeper changes in Canadian attitudes rather than temporary responses to immediate political events. The implications of this transformation extended beyond tourism and retail impacts to encompass questions about the future nature of North American integration and the resilience of relationships that had been assumed to be permanent fixtures of continental geography. The invisible border had become visible through the systematic withdrawal of millions of Canadians who had simply decided that crossing was no longer worth the effort or risk. The data revealed that cross-border relationships built over generations could be disrupted rapidly when political trust eroded. The speed and scale of Canadian withdrawal challenged fundamental assumptions about the stability of integrated North American systems. What had appeared permanent proved vulnerable to political tensions that transformed daily behaviors across entire populations. The measurement challenges associated with documenting the full scope of border transformation highlighted the limitations of traditional statistical approaches, to understanding complex social and economic phenomena. While vehicle crossing data provided clear evidence of reduced travel, the full implications for business relationships, family connections, cultural exchanges, and community ties remained difficult to quantify, but were clearly significant. The recovery timeline for cross-border relationships remained uncertain as 2025 concluded and 2026 began. Historical precedents suggested that trust-based relationships require extended periods to rebuild once damaged, and the systematic nature of Canadian withdrawal suggested that restoration would require more than policy changes or political reconciliation. The invisible border crisis had revealed that the most important barriers between nations are not physical infrastructure or legal frameworks, but rather the psychological willingness of populations to engage with their neighbors. The legacy of 2025 would be measured not only in economic losses or statistical declines, but in the fundamental recalibration of North American relationships that had been assumed to be permanent features of continental geography. 7.6 million Canadians had voted with their feet, and their quiet revolution had reshaped the meaning of the world's longest undefended border.